Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Bill, I will answer your question. We are going to focus on what's most common in the East. Probably best to cover what you're asking in the chat or in the question and answer period, because that's where it's going to be most applicable to answer those questions. We're going to go ahead and start. You've seen this graphic before. Today we're going to talk about planning a pasture system. While I'm going to touch on plants and forages and systems, we're really not going to get into that in any depth until we get to the next two seminars, and certainly nutrition and health problems will deal with some of that as well. So you know who your instructors are. Susan's already told you. That is a picture of our research center, and in the very back, that's me bringing some of our bucks forward into our handling system. We're going to do some data collection. So you can see we, at least in this picture, enjoyed some green grass and green leaves. Some years we get that, and some years we're semi-arid dry as well. And really some of the alternative forages is where the way we handle some of that in Maryland, but we'll talk about that as we go. So when we talk about planning a pasture system, I can't stress enough that you have to have this system planning around your personal goals for your farm and your operation. It's not up to myself or people like myself and Susan to tell you what to do. And we don't come with any biases, or try not to anyway. We're not trying to tell you how you should do it. We don't think that everyone should be like folks in New Zealand or Ireland or Montana or whatever. We need to help you distill your goals, and then through that we'll be able to help you plan your system. You need to take an inventory of your farm resources. Then you're going to need to develop your management system of your forage resources, and last but not least, and I can't at all emphasize this enough, is be flexible. Don't any of you that have had any experience with agriculture and livestock and forages, you know for a fact that you have to make a lot of these decisions on the fly, and so I say be flexible. When I do these seminars live, I tell people never plant a permanent post except for perimeter fence until you've gotten some of the bugs worked out. So what's your goals for your pasture system? You need to establish some well thought out goals to direct and develop your system. You need to apply these strategies, and remember, they're going to be unique to your operation. I think that you can learn from other people, but even in our state, we have enough microclimates that you can't take a carbon copy of one farm and transfer it to another farm. You can certainly learn some things, but you don't necessarily, it's not going to be a carbon copy. And then I really believe you need to evaluate and update your goals. I would say annually. I think for some people it's going to be, at least on the front end of this planning system, it's going to be maybe more often. Once you get more and more established, it may be less often, but I think you really need to step back and evaluate what you're doing. Here's just some examples of goals. These aren't necessarily yours. I probably didn't even put yours down there. Maybe one of yours was to have fun, but maybe you want to increase your livestock numbers. Maybe you want to increase your forage availability. Some people are into performance and they want to improve. They want to, average daily gain. Some of these things that people really get enthused about. Maybe for lots of people, it's reduced feed costs or labor. I will caution you on that particular one is, remember, at least in the Mid-Atlantic, land is not free. And a lot of people don't figure land costs or rental or whatever in a production system. And of course, soil is the basis of all this, and reducing soil erosion, increasing or improving soil health is another buzzword, especially this year, the year of the soil, is certainly something to be thought of. What are your resources? You have permanent resources, semi-permanent resources, and of course variable resources. And for those of you that raise Suffolks. Those are real meat Suffolks there from England, unlike those big tall things that we raise here in the United States. My apologies to Suffolk breeders. Permanent resources, of course, humans. That may be you and your husband or your wife or your kids or your grandkids or whatever. Those are going to be resources, and they also will be variable resources. You know, it's hard to categorize some of these things as we talk, but certainly, you know, especially we see it a lot here. You know, a child goes off to college. You know, your human resources just change dramatically in some cases, and or you know you get some grandchildren to get interested, and again, maybe your labor has increased. Land, and again, that can be variable, especially if you're in rented land, and you know, those things, sometimes you keep it for a long time. Sometimes, you know, you pick up a piece of land that lasts for a short period of time. Water bodies, and when I say water bodies, that's different than water sources like a watering trough or so on. I'm talking about streams, talking about in the sense of sensitive areas, bogs, wet spots, seasonal springs, all kind of things like that. And then existing buildings, and I put existing buildings in there because if you're like most people, myself included, if you buy a property and it's got a building on it, you're going to try to use it, even though maybe the best thing that could possibly happen would be a fire. Most of us, if we're in agriculture, we're typically conservatives, and we always try to use whatever we have already on the property. And so existing buildings become permanent resources, or are permanent resources, until we either repurpose them, tear them down, or build more structures. And again, like I said, human resources are one of the most overlooked and undervalued. If you're truly a shepherd or whatever, you don't value your time. As a matter of fact, you undervalue your time. I've done plenty of farm management work with farmers, and they grossly underpay themselves. Some of them will be better off to sell the place and you know, go work at McDonald's. They'd probably make more per hour. Now that's certainly not a lifestyle choice, but it certainly is one of those things that I tell you, don't overlook the human resource piece, because one day you're going to wake up and that teenage boy that you couldn't get to high school is going to be gone, and now you're going to be short a person. So, and again, who and how many, and it's the number one limiter to success. You can certainly stretch yourself too far, and you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And again, when you get to your land resources, how many acres do you have, how big, your soil type, and your slope and your aspect, those are very important things to take into consideration when you're setting up a system. You know, your soil type is going to influence what types of forages you're able to grow. Your slope, of course, is going to be one of those, and aspect are going to be one of those things that are going to play into where do we winter the flock, you know, those kind of things. Certainly how we lay out paddocks, slope and aspect have a great deal of, when I say aspect, I mean the face. You know, and that's more important to grape growers, really. But when you look at a slope that has a northern face, that's not somewhere, at least in our country here, and certainly, Richard, in Maine, where you're buried in snow, it's not somewhere that a flock's going to winter, because they're going to be getting that north wind right in their face. So if they have a southern or eastern aspect, that's certainly going to be a good spot for them to get out of the wind if you're out wintering. And again, some people outwinter and some people don't. But in most times, you know, livestock prefer to be outside. Barns are built for humans. There are times when barns are very important, and I didn't mean to sound like a judgmental statement, but it certainly is something to think about. Acreage, how much is enough? What's your availability? I can't answer how much is enough. You know, we have very successful dry lot operations that are not rich in acreage. Uh, you know, certainly the availability is going to be one thing that will dictate how much acreage you have. And when I say availability, I don't just mean for purchase. I mean for rent. Some people have the ability to rent small parcels spread around. Basically, here in the Mid-Atlantic, where little fiefdoms are built out in the countryside, and someone decides all of a sudden they're tired of mowing that 10 or 15 or 5 acres, you can swoop in and rent that ground, and in some cases do it very um, realistically or inexpensively, and you can get some acreage that way. And then permanency, again, plays into that same thing. How long are you going to be able to keep it? In some cases, properties are rented for years and years on end, and other times, that 5 acre lot that you've been renting for 5 years, all of a sudden, your landlord's child decides they want to build a house, and there it goes. So um, there's all kinds of things that play into that acreage piece, but certainly, again, here um, we don't just mean the land that you own, but the land that you might be able to rent. Even in some cases, when you think about it, depending on where you're located, you can certainly maybe make a deal with the neighbor who has some corn stalks that they've are going to let in the field over the winter. You can, put some temporary fencing around those kind of things. There's always other opportunities, so don't just. The point there is don't get stuck in the paradigm that I have to own every acre of land. Soil type, we're looking at, is it well drained? Is it drouthy? Is it wet or boggy? What's the productivity? I'll come back to the productivity piece in a second, but well drained soils is what we all want, and well drained is different than drouthy soils. Drouthy soils in at least here in western Maryland are shaly soils where they can be soppy wet one day and bone dry in 2 days. Where a well-drained soil, when you dig into it, even after in a dry period, you can still feel the moisture in the soil. And of course, wet or boggy soils, that's fairly self-explanatory. It's those soils that typically are low and hold a lot of wet, a lot of moisture over time. Typically, maybe they don't dry out until July, or depending on where you're at, located in the states, maybe they never dry out. Productivity, a good way to get a ballpark figure on productivity. In other words, how much grass or how much forage can I produce is a website called Web Soil Survey, and I apologize, I should have had a link here on this page for that. But basically, if you just put Web Soil Survey into your favorite search engine, it will come up, and you can get on there and put in your property address, and a map will come up, and you can look at your soil types. And then there's another drop-down menu where you can look at productivity, and you can either look at it based on a row crop. If the way you judge productivity is completely up to you, because if it can support 200 bushels of corn, it can certainly support adequate amount of pasture. But there is some hay, there is some pasture figures in there that you can also look at. And I would recommend you do that. Look up your property on Web Soil Survey and see what type of soil you have if you don't know. This is completely different from a soil test, and we'll get into that when we get into the more agronomic pieces of these webinars. But today I'm just talking about Oaks Dairy put Web Soil Survey up there, but it's a great opportunity and a great website. I will tell you, especially if you're in the East, it works much faster in the morning when the Californians get on it. In other words, think about bandwidth. As the day gets longer, we get more and more people on it using it, so sometimes the speed does slow down a little bit. As I said, slope and aspect, flat and steep. which way does your slope face? Um, and bodies of water, springs, ponds, streams. Here in Maryland, we're under nutrient management regulations, and our livestock are to be excluded from ponds, springs, and streams. That may or may not be the case wherever you call home, but here that's exactly what we are called to do. And so when you're setting up a pasture system, you need to take those kind of things into consideration. Certainly bogs are self-explanatory. We don't want to be putting livestock into bogs on a regular basis if we don't have to. I mean, crossing them or something like that is one thing, but we're not raising cranberries. We're raising livestock. Seasonal springs are something, again, that it's not going to so much preclude you from including them in the pasture, but you will certainly rotate differently when it comes to seasonal springs. Again, you don't want a lot of pugging or tearing up of the soil and forage, so that's gonna play into it. In our country here in Western Maryland, we have karst topography, limestone soil, so we have sinkholes. Lots of people have sinkholes. Our sinkholes here are not like the ones in Florida, but they are here nonetheless, and you need to take those into consideration for a number of reasons, not the least of which is safety. You can, depending on your sinkhole size, you can lose a limb or two, and some of them around here anyway. Wooded areas, as you plan your system, can you use wooded areas for shelter, shade in the summertime? Are you trying to clear or control the understory, which goats are awesome at? Again, take those things into consideration as you're planning your system, and utilize your livestock in such a way that you can accomplish some of your goals. Existing buildings. When I say headquarters, I mean basically where you start from. So if you have a barn, if you have a hoop house or whatever, but basically the starting point of all the things that you do. Do you have a handling facility? Certainly if you're going to get of any size, I recommend a handling facility. I think they're a great asset. Shelter, again, we've talked about that a little bit, and we'll talk about a little bit more in depth when we get into management systems. But shelter is important at times. I'm not opposed to shelter or shade or any of those things, but I can tell you that shelter also needs to include proper ventilation. It certainly is something that we want to make sure we're not buttoning up your buildings too tightly. And like I said, we'll talk about that in more in depth when we get into some systems. Some of your semi-permanent resources is your water supply, and when I say that, I mean your drilled wells, your springs, those kind of things that are think here, developed human intervention here. I'm not talking about the little stream that runs down through the pasture field or anything like that. I'm talking about something more man-made, and then permanent fences, and then some trees. When I talk about permanent fences, what I'm talking about here is really perimeter fences and laneway fences. I think that a lot of times when folks move to a property, they think that the fences are there permanent, and while they may end up being permanent or where you want them, a lot of times those fences are not or should not be permanent. Don't let someone else's decision on a fence row or fence line dictate what you're going to do. Certainly I don't recommend you move in today and start clearing fence rows tomorrow. I think everything should be done with a measured approach, but ultimately you're going to find out where the fences need to be, and that's why I don't like a lot of permanent fencing except for laneways and perimeter fence. mainly because your neighbors will typically frown on your livestock roaming their property or getting onto the roadways. Um, as far as trees go, again, we talked about that a little bit with wooded area. What kind of trees are they, and do we really want to protect them from, browse and so on and so forth? That will depend on how you treat those. You can indeed graze orchards and such things, but you're just going to want to be precautious. You just want to take precautions when it comes to how you're going to manage that system. Some variable resources, and we'll talk about these in depth, but certainly forages, the livestock, temporary fencing, laneways, and certainly at the end your management system. Forages, what are your existing forages? If you inherited a property, bought a property, what do you have out there? And take a forage inventory, know what you have. Are you probably, at least if you're here in the east, you're probably looking at a cool season perennial forage is probably what you have in your pastures. After that, you're going to have some forbs, and what we call forbs is what your neighbor who has Chemlawn come out calls weeds, but you'll probably have some dock and plantain and dandelion and so on and so forth. So look at what your forages are, make an assessment. What are the conditions? Do you have a lot of open space? Do you have a lot of weed competition? And when I say weeds, I truly mean undesirable plants such as thistle and pigweed and some of those types of things, not at all what I was talking about when it comes to dock and some of those other forbs. What is the seasonal distribution of your forage? Again, here in the Mid-Atlantic, we have basically two growth spurts for our cool season perennial pastures. We get a big flush of growth in the spring, and we get another smaller flush of growth in the fall, and then we get kind of a flat line and what we call a seasonal slump in the summertime. And what we'll do, and we'll talk about this again in depth when we get into the forage piece, is how are we going to manage that summer slump? And are we going to use warm season annuals such as the goats there in the picture they're grazing? Actually, that's a forage sorghum. I play around a bit when it comes to forages on our goat test, and I have the flexibility that some of you might not have because our stocking density is not that high. I wouldn't recommend forage sorghum in a lot of cases, but for browse for goats, it worked well for us in this situation. I think we had maybe 85 goats on this piece. This was 2 years ago, and so the browse worked very well. It's up. The goats like to get up, get their heads up, and eat, and it really did work well for us. But again, your choice of forages is going to have to be unique to what will be unique potentially to your area. Quality forage comes from planning, not by luck. And quality forage is something we'll talk about when we get to the forage piece a little more in depth. But you really have to look at your forages and your quality and timing of your grazing and so on and so forth. And it's going to be pretty important, and we'll talk in a little bit more about why that is. Your livestock. What species do you have? Do you have sheep? Do you have goats? Do you have llamas, alpacas? Do you have cattle, horses? How many? What are your numbers? And look at your acreage and match your numbers in your acreage. Species is one of those things, and I saw in the questionnaire that Susan had out that there was a couple dairy that had clicked or checked dairy. I don't know if that's dairy goats or not, but here in our county, we have he's passed away now, but an avid sheepman. He would always come to pasture walks on dairy farms, and one of the first things you would tell those guys is they let way too much forage in the field. They need to have a flock of sheep to follow those dairy cows. And I don't disagree with them, but as you well know, you can keep a dairy cow in with one wire, and you really can't do that with sheep. But anyway, that's something to think about. Multi-species grazing, which we'll get into a little more in depth in another session, is a really good way to utilize forage, income, add some income, and also add some cattle will act as a guard to the smaller ruminants once they're acclimated. So there's a lot of advantages to it, but it's not for everyone. I know a lot of people don't like cattle because of their size and so on. So I'm not trying to tell you everyone that has sheep should have cows or everyone that has goats should have cattle. I'm just saying that that's an option. The class of the animal is going to be very important. When I say class, what I mean is, are they growing? Well, you have two high demand classes in this picture, a lactating ewe and a growing lamb, or actually two growing lambs. Your forage is going to have to be much, much higher quality for these animals than if you had a bunch of fiber wethers that all you did was shear them and spin. So that class of animal is going to have a lot lower demand. Think about it, a buck's out of breeding season. Again, not a great demand when it comes nutritionally, but what we have on the ground here in front of us, this lactating ewe, based on the size of her lamb, this is early lactation. We got high demand for forage quality in both the ewe and the lamb. So certainly it's one of those things that that you're really going to have to take into consideration. Temporary fencing. What type of temporary fencing? How many? And what's your livestock? As far as type goes, there's a lot of different types of temporary fences, and I will just stick one of my personal biases in here. One type of fence that I really don't like is barbed wire, and another one that I really don't like is people who electrify barbed wire. But outside of that, I think you can almost use any type of fencing, anywhere from livestock panels, welded panels, to polywire and everything in between. And there's places for all those things. For those of you that like pretty fences, board fences work fine. Electronetting, which you see in the picture, works fine. I'm a little averse to that because I can't ever get it rolled up without getting it tangled in. Then that takes me, an hour and a half to get it untangled. But when it's used properly and when you're smarter than I am, it's a great fence for temporary and semi-temporary fencing. Smooth, high tensile wire is a great perimeter fence. You have to decide how many wires you need based on what you're trying to keep in and, more importantly, what you're trying to keep out. We often think of fences as being something that we're going to, we're trying to keep our sheep in or our goats in, when in fact you may also be hoping and planning to keep the neighbor's dog, or in our area we have coyotes, predators. We want to be cognizant of those as well. As far as how many fences, again, I'm really adverse to people getting too excited about permanent fences when you can use polywire and step-in posts or electronet and step-in posts until you've done it a couple years and know just about where the fencing should be. There's a real good place for semi-permanent fencing. And then, like I said, once you're a little more established, you kind of know, then you're probably just going to use the temporary fencing to break your paddocks into cells and so on and so forth, and maybe strip graze. Or I've seen some things in the chat about using corn stalks and so on. You get more utilization if you strip graze those as opposed to just turning them out and letting them have the whole field. Again, that's a management system that we'll certainly talk about those kind of things in depth. And then again, your livestock. Obviously, that electronetting is not going to do much for a cow. if she gets wrapped up in it, you're really not going to be happy about it. So some fences don't work for some livestock, and certainly if you're mixing your species, uh, more so with size than with anything else, you're going to have to base your fencing on that. Another thing that you need to think about when you're using fencing, and especially if you're going to use the American wire or the woven wire, or whatever you want to call that type of fencing, is remember, if you have goats or sheep with horns, you want to make sure your size of your opening is either big enough they can get their head back out of, or small enough that they can't ever get their head through. You only have to pull a dead sheep or goat out of a fence they've been struggling to get their horns back through once before you figure out that's not um, a great idea. Um, Watching a little bit into the text box, remember that guard animals are still important. Fences can only do so much, and if you've got, I saw wolves and coyotes, or coyotes, cougars, and bears. Yeah, I wouldn't even begin to know how to take care of a cougar. Laneways. As you develop your system, you're going to need to know how to get your livestock from here to there. And as you start planning that, there's going to be some semi-permanent laneways. There's going to be widths. How wide do you want it to be? There are some rules of thumb, but some other things may come into play. You may make it wider than it needs to be because it's not just for the livestock, but maybe you're trying to move a tractor and mower down that laneway. So there's some things that certainly will play into that width. What kind of base are you going to have and surface? Those, and again, as we get into systems, we'll talk about these a little more in depth, and we'll actually talk about, and I'll have a graphic and a link that talks about building these laneways. But we want to talk about you want a firm base, you want a good surface. Some of you may have some advantages that others don't. At one point, we had an advantage here in Western Maryland. We had a shingle factory plant that made shingles, and the little tabs, when I say tabs, I mean that little thing that's cut out of your shingle, we used for surfacing our laneways, and at one time they gave them away, so it was very inexpensive, and we used that. Contour, what's your slope? You need to be careful of that when you're building laneways, because you don't want to make your laneway a gully or some other thing. And then you always want them to be crowned. Just like the crown roads, you want to make sure that they drain. So you don't want a laneway that's going to hold water. You want to have a laneway that's going to be crowned and going to move water away from it. Again, we're going to get into depth with this in the third, but we're going to talk about it a little bit now. And again, these webinars, it's a non-judgment zone, if you will. These are all management systems, and they all work for some people and won't work for other people. Continuous grazing is what a lot of people do, especially small and part-time beef cattle guys. They basically open the gate in the spring and turn the cows out, and then when forage gets tight, they feed hay, and then it rains in the fall and they don't feed hay, and then in the winter they feed hay again, and those kind of things. Probably there, some other folks that do that with another horse people and other people that are egregious when it comes to continuous grazing. Simple rotation, that was something probably most of your grandparents did. Certainly mine did. They had 4 pastures, and they just, this was the night pasture this week, and this was the day pasture this week, and then they'd flip them. And that was a very common, and still is done to a certain extent. Intensive rotational grazing, the guys down in the South Pacific have made a lot of hay with this one, and we've adapted it here in the United States. And again, it can be as intensive as you want it to be. You don't have to, please, when you put a system together, do not make it so constrained that you don't want to do the moving. As I was talking to a gentleman today on the phone, if you set up a system flexible enough that, You know what? If you were planning to move the sheep to a new pasture on Saturday and all of a sudden you get a call and your grandson's got a baseball game and you go to the baseball game and you don't get the sheep moved till Sunday, nobody's going to die. A lot of people are afraid of intensive rotational grazing because they read about the dairymen in New Zealand that move their cows every 12 hours. Understand, they milk those cows every 12 hours, so they come into the parlor. So it's real easy for them to move them every 12 hours. Don't set up a system that you're going to hate to operate. Mob grazing is another one of those systems that have become very popular. It's more difficult to do with small ruminants than it is to do with cattle, and I only say that because here in the east most of our flocks are small. But when we talk about mob grazing, we're talking about a lot of animal units, a lot of pounds of animal on a small area. And small is relative based on the amount of animals. Strip grazing is very common when it comes to grazing things like winter cereals or crop aftermath. Basically, you're just putting a wire in front of the animals and moving it and allowing them to move across the field. It is a way to really to economize on your forage, especially if it's limited, or in the case of grazing crop aftermath, it's a way to get better utilization because you're only giving them a little bit at a time, so they'll clean up what they have in front of them before they get more. Creep grazing can either be intentional or unintentional. Some of you probably already do some unintentional creep grazing, and that would be those of you that have lambs that scoot under a wire and they go into the next paddock and graze while mom's on the other side. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That lamb is never going to let mom get too far away. So but there are folks that do purposeful creep grazing, and they have some areas where they'll absolutely positively not only allow but encourage the lambs or the kids to go in front of the does and ewes to take basically to cream off, to take the best of that forage off first. Targeted and prescribed grazing, those systems, at least here again in the east, we have folks that do that for a fee. They'll come in and bring a group of goats in to prescribed graze. I know they do it out west for fire control, and we do it here in the east again for more for weed and vegetation control. But you're targeting a specific place, and you have a specific goal other than providing forage to your livestock. Certainly that's a benefit, and that's certainly something you're trying to do, but you're really managing vegetation when I talk about prescribed grazing. I think also in the Northeast, in New England, I think that's some folks control plant growth on ski slopes in the summertime in a very similar way. They get a shepherd to bring in a flock of sheep or some goats, and they keep that as opposed to mowing them, which is also another option. So we're a little bit giving you about 14 minutes to ask questions, plus we're not in any hurry here, but I do want you to ask questions and encourage you to ask questions. It doesn't matter that we're going to go in more depth in some of these areas. You can certainly ask, but I will throw it open for questions if you've got some questions. On the slide right now is our contact information, both Susan's and myself. We're both really good at email, and I can't speak for Susan, but myself, we answer email a lot of different hours of the day and night. So feel free to email, and we'll be happy to answer your questions or point you in another direction. Before we get too far into the question period, next Wednesday is our next webinar, and we will talk about pasture plants. And when I talk about alternative forages, I'll be specifically talking about some alternative forages that we've used here at the Western Maryland Research and Education Center, and certainly there'll be other alternative forages that may not be appropriate for us here in the east, but certainly other places. And just a little teaser, we grazed sun hemp last year with great success, and that'll be one of the alternative forages that we'll talk about. Bill's question there about evening out your pasture, it's really difficult. One of the things is you can move your animals faster across the paddocks to keep them more vegetative. Of course, a lot of people will, if they can't do it themselves, they'll hire it done, but they'll make hay for winter, and that will allow you to, if you've got enough land anyway, you'll just shorten up. You'll decide, okay, this particular year I can take so many paddocks out of my spring rotation, and I can make some hay. But it is difficult because you get a big flush in the spring, or at least we do here. And if you don't have enough livestock, the other thing you want to think about is time some of your production cycles to match your forage. So time your lambing and your kidding when you've got that high demand for forage quality and forage growth as well. I will tell you one thing about cutting hay or hay is one of the things is to remember typically, unless you've already got the equipment, it is absolutely positively cheaper to have it custom done, and secondly, it's cheaper to buy it to make it yourself, or at least it is here in Western Maryland. And when you get into quality aspects, especially if you're going to feed some of that good hay, you see it on those triplets there, you're probably going to need to buy that quality of hay, because unless you're full-time on the farm, somebody else is probably going to make a better hay than you can make, for sure. Square baling is a problem for sure. There are a lot of folks that have gone to round bales because of their personal operation, and if you've got someone around that makes straw, bale straw, they've almost probably got a square baler. And even if they won't mow your hay, maybe they'll allow you to borrow the baler or rent the baler, or maybe you can have someone else cut it and have them use the baling. Richard makes a good point about keeping records. You can't measure, or you can't manage what you don't measure, and that's a very important point. When we get into some management systems, we'll talk about that in depth. A lot of times when you talk about record-keeping systems, people go a shade of white. Again, you need to make the record-keeping work for you, but you do need to have records. It's very, very difficult to, to manage something you don't measure. You can make it simple on yourself with, if you got a calendar with big blocks, big date blocks in. We make a grazing calendar. We publish a grazing calendar here in Maryland, and that's exactly why the blocks are the size they are. You can get yourself a notebook. Some of our guys like the little pocket-sized notebooks. I know one of the AI studs used to give them away. If you're they liked them because they fit in their shirt pocket and they could act almost like a diary. If you got one that fits in your hip pocket, something like that. But you don't have to make it real complex, but you do have to make a system, because unless you're got a photographic or eidetic memory, which I certainly don't, it's going to be real hard for you to remember things about when and where and how and why. And again, you'll learn your productive paddocks. Where is that paddock that I can move my animals back to that paddock quicker? So that may be one of those paddocks that you save for, the lactating ewes, or you save for rotating and we'll make hay somewhere else, or some other things like that. It's really a great um, idea. If you like spreadsheets, do yourself a spreadsheet. If you're into access or data, those kind of things, you know, the sky's the limit. But don't be afraid of records, because if you don't keep any records, that's worse than um, some system that you think is not very sophisticated. For those of you that like smartphones and tablets, as Susan just said, there are applications. You can go to, there's several grazing applications that come out of New Zealand. I have one on my tablet. Unfortunately, I don't have my tablet with me, but I can tell you, I think it's called iHerd, but little I heard, I'm sure, Steve Jobs isn't happy about their name, but, they're in New Zealand, so I guess they are outside of Apple's purview. But that's one system, of course, as you might well imagine. It is a system that was developed for the New Zealand dairy industry, but again, anybody can adapt a record-keeping system. You don't have to worry about the fact that you're moving your sheep and there's cow icons on the thing, for sure. Yeah, there was a comment about using Google Maps to locate pastures and temporary fencing. You certainly, whatever mapping software or whatever you want to do, I think it's a good idea. Here in Washington County, our Soil Conservation District will make maps for you if you can't make them yourself. I'm not promising that for the rest of the United States, but here they will do that, and they will put if you know where you've got fences, they'll put them in for you. They'll put in water where you've got waters and so on and so forth. So it's certainly one of those things. The question about what is the minimum size pasture that you would recommend for 6 to 12 sheep, again, it really depends on how, can you get by with, our rule of thumb, my rule of thumb is one animal unit, and that's 1,000 pounds of animal for 2 acres. So if you figure you've got 100-pound sheep, so that's 10 sheep, and you need 2 acres. Now, that's a rule of thumb, and rule of thumbs are just what they are. Some years that will work beautifully, and other years when you get dry weather, that won't work so beautifully. And that works for us here in the Mid-Atlantic, but that won't work in Montana. So please don't think of this as being gospel when you get some answers from me. If you get an answer and you roll your eyes and say that'll never work out here in the sand hills, I can certainly appreciate that, because I've been, and yes, it is one animal unit per 12 months per 2 acres. And certainly I wouldn't suggest, when you get that tight of a stocking rate, I wouldn't suggest you do continuous grazing. But again, yes, exactly, there in South Carolina, soil types and climate makes such a difference. If we have someone that's listening from the Middle East, and I said, an animal unit per 2 acres, they probably just rolled over dead. They could never do that. The question would that be without added feed? Sometimes. Again, one of the other things, and I should have put this slide in, but it'll certainly be in next week's. I have what I call pasture myths. And one of those pasture myths is, if I set up a pasture system, I'll never feed anything, any supplemental feed again. That is completely a myth. We've had years here in Washington County anyway, when it stops raining about the 15th of May and we don't get anything until September, you're going to learn to feed supplemental feeds differently. Typically we've been trained, or the paradigm has been, that we feed supplemental feeds in the winter and we feed pasture in the summer. That's not correct, especially in a managed system. there will be times when you're going to bring those animals into the dry lot or into the barn and feed hay, or you're going to feed grain, or you're going to feed, because there's just not enough forage out there. As far as allowing your herd or your flock to graze wooded areas, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, as long as there's not what you're looking for is sensitive as areas. And when I say that, if you're trying to grow ginseng in your understory, probably grazing is not a great idea. But in most cases, browse and understory makes acceptable forage, again, depending on the class of animal. I wouldn't turn lactating ewes into an understory without allowing them to have some other forage to eat. One of the things we'll just touch on a little bit, and certainly when we get to the health issues, and I'm surprised no one's asked the question, is poisonous plants. In most cases, and again, there's always outliers, poisonous plants are typically not an issue in well-managed and in management systems where livestock are well-fed. Typically, if they're going to eat a poisonous plant, they're going to do so because they're very hungry. Remember, poisonous plants they have alkaloids and lots of things that are certainly not one of those things that are attractive. Lots of them have thorns or other things, so poisonous plants can be an issue, but typically they're not.